Well, Bob Hawke, the Australian Rights Today, personified the very best and worst in Australians. A new biography by Troy Bramston chronicles the stunning triumphs and the shocking failures of Australia's 23rd Prime Minister. Joining me live now is author Troy Bramston. Thanks so much for your time. Good to see you. What was
Thanks,
the
Laura.
best and worst of Bob Hawke? And in writing this biography, were you shocked by anything?
Look, I was shocked. I mean, we all know that Bob Hawke lived a supercharged existence. He was a larrikin intellectual. One of the themes of the book is, of course, that he fought demons, the drinking, the womanising, the infidelity, and the emotional outbursts. You know, he would often have tears on television, or in the 1960s or 70s, he'd get very cranky with journalists, and his temper would explode. So I found that his flaws were much more significant than we realise. And I go to some length to explain the horrible drinking in the 60s and 70s, the impact that had on his marriage and his family life, and of course the womanising and the affairs which continued into his prime ministership. But on the flip side, Laura, he is our most popular post-war prime minister. He had a visceral connection with the Australian people. He loved them. They loved him. He led Labor to 4 election victories in a row. And of course, he left a vast legacy across the board in economic policy, social policy, environmental issues, or indeed on the world stage. So he was a great prime minister, better than I thought when I started the project, but a much more deeply flawed person.
Why was he such a good Prime Minister, do you think?
Well, look, he made it look easy. I mean, he did have that connection with the Australian people. He was authentic. What you saw was what you got. He never pretended to be somebody else. They knew that he loved them and they loved him. But he was also very good at running a government. So I spent a lot of time in the book, Laura, explaining how he led a government. And, you know, we've had a host of prime ministers from across the political divide in recent years that seem to struggle with the basics about keeping a party united, leading a cabinet effectively. You know, he always welcomed frank and fearless advice from public servants. He wanted his advisors to be upfront with him about things. He let ministers do their job, and he was blessed to have a very, very talented cabinet and ministry, as you've just seen there on the screen. He was the chairman of the board, and I asked Paul Keating whether he would accept that, and he said to me, yes, I accepted. He was like a chairman of the board who set the strategic direction, but Keating labelled himself the managing director. So he had this great partnership. He had this great ability to run a government and manage a party through a period of profound change.
He lived at a time where I think prime ministers were afforded their private life. I think it's very different now, and we've seen that change in recent years. With all that was going on behind the scenes, Troy, do you think he would have survived in a 2022 environment?
There's no doubt that politics is much tougher today, even though Hawke was a highly skilled political leader and prime minister. I mean, we didn't have Sky News, for example, 24-hour news. We didn't have social media in the 1980s. So that is a big change. Look, would Bob Hawke be able to get away with what he did back then, and particularly in terms of having the affairs? Probably not. You know, but I think the media and public generally had a different standard in which they kept politicians to. Times have changed. Hawke did give up the drinking, you know, when he went into Parliament in 1980. So he could show discipline and purpose and resolve when he wanted to. I think he probably would have struggled to give up the affairs, though. But, you know, Hawke was a terrible drunk in the 1960s and 70s. He had alcohol poisoning a number of times. He nearly drank himself to death. And he surprised everyone who knew him well that he could actually give it up. And he gave it up because he wanted to be Prime Minister. So he had that discipline. Could he do it today with women? I'm not so sure.
Well, so he gave up the drink once he entered Parliament. Through your research, do you think he held to that? He obviously did continue the womanising.
Yeah, look, he absolutely held to the abstinence. You know, his mother was actually a leader in the Christian temperance movement. She instilled in both of her sons that alcohol was the devil's work on earth and it should be eradicated from society. So he broke his mother's heart when he started drinking it at the University of Western Australia. But he did give it up. Occasionally people would say, oh, you know, I saw Bob Hawke out and about having a beer. What he did do was he drank non-alcoholic beer imported from Germany, but he certainly gave it up. There's no evidence that he was on the drink as Prime Minister, but as I detail in the book, he didn't give up the womanising, and he had a number of affairs while he was Prime Minister. But, you know, interestingly, Hazel Hawke's view was that the drinking was the worst aspect of his life that she had to deal with. She could tolerate the
Wow.
affairs, as incredible as that is for us to understand. It was the drinking that led to the arguments, the disappointing relationships with the children, and him being unreliable and being home late and being a hopeless father and a husband. So it was the drinking that actually worried her the most. And when he did give it up, their marriage entered a very happy phase during the prime ministership.
One thing that strikes me this week as we mourn the death of Shane Warne, that there are some parallels here. Stay with me. It's that people crave authenticity. It was true when Bob Hawke was Prime Minister, and it's true today.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great story in the book, which obviously I didn't know that Shane Warne sadly would be leaving us in the last few days. But Shane Warne's mother, Bridget, actually helped Hazel with the cleaning at home in the 1970s. And Shane and Jason Warne would go over to the Hawke house and play with the children. And Bob Hawke even gave a very young Shane Warne a few tips on bowling
Wow.
on the family tennis court out the back. But yes, you're right. I mean, Shane Warne was authentic. He didn't pretend to be somebody else. He was open about his flaws. He recognised them, and so did Bob Hawke. But there is a bit of a tragic element too, because when I interviewed Bob just before he died, I said to him, do you have any personal regrets? And he said, yeah, I wasn't a good father and I wasn't a good husband. But then when you ask, would he have changed anything if he could do it all again? And the answer was no. So, there's a bit of a tragic element in that. And I found that very sad as a father and a husband myself, to think that you'd come to the end of your life and you'd have those deep regrets, but you really wouldn't change anything if you could do it again.
Troy Bramston, good luck with the launch tonight. Looking forward to reading it in all my spare time. Good luck. It is quite a body of work.
Thanks so much, Laura. Good to talk to you.